Hey y'all, I'm Sunny Shell, and tonight we're going to discuss archaeology. So sit back, buckle up, and let's get to the sunny spot on Skeptic Haven. Hey everybody! I am so excited because I have once again the wonderful Pat Lowinger on. And Pat, for those who may not know you, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I guess professionally, I'm an archaeologist. That's what I do for a living, and a historian because I teach and do consulting work for archaeologists here in archaeology here in Washington. And in the summers, for those that know me, I spend my summers in Europe at various excavations. But now I'm pretty narrowly focused on work in the UK, having lost our permit in Romania. I won't be returning there anytime soon. But COVID being what it was. And so I'm currently conducting research. My ultimate terminal goal is a PhD in archaeology. My research focus is the transition of spaces in antiquity. Basically, one group lives here, makes some stuff. They either leave it or it goes out of use. And then another group, maybe that same group at another time, readopts using it, or another group comes in and starts using it, or doing something with it, or ignoring it. And I study those transitions of sacred spaces for everything like how do we make it, how's it become sacred, how's it used, and how's it transferred between cultural groups.
That's so cool. Well, I love whenever you're on because I learn so much from you. And today we're going to talk about one is about your recent trip to the UK, but let's start with ancient burial practices. So, what can we learn from ancient burial practices? Let's just start there.
All the good stuff.
All the good stuff.
Well, we we have to look at a couple things. A lot of the cultures that we study, particularly ancient cultures, are prehistoric. It means we don't have any records of writings or inscriptions or anything about them. Now, in places like Egypt, we're pretty lucky. Mesopotamia, we're pretty lucky. We have cuneiform in the case of Mesopotamia. We have various hieroglyphic texts in the case of Egypt. But still, those texts don't tell us everything we need to know about the ancient peoples. You can learn a lot about what people did in life by how they're kind of emulating their activities in death. We learn a lot about what the ancient Egyptians believed by how they were buried. Again, Egypt's not the area of my focus, but I think for illustrative purposes, anybody familiar with the creation of not just tombs, but just burial spaces for ancient Egyptians. I mean, there was a wide gap between how what we call poor or common people were buried with the Egyptian elite, but we can examine both of those burial types and learn quite a bit about the ancient Egyptians, not just some of their belief practices, but also like how they ate, how were their clothes manufactured. A lot of stuff can be gained from just looking through people's burial goods, and that's important as well. And then different practices, how you bury your dead, sometimes can quite tell us quite a bit about your religious and spiritual beliefs, if that's how we want to approach that type of analysis. I love studying burials, and it's one of the few things that survives the archaeological record pretty well intact. Once you stick someone in the ground, they decompose, sure, but we don't have to worry about the house they were in being knocked down and not having a lot of evidentiary value, which happens quite a bit. And then people moving in on top of other people, sometimes they literally just start stacking bodies in graveyards, which is the case we had this year in the UK. So we can see the transition between occupation layers being reflected sometimes in cemeteries, for lack of a better term, grave areas where bodies are deposited. They start seeing different levels of transition as well. You can see comings and going, different culture groups coming in, moving in on top of the older cultural group, and sometimes commingling and sometimes displacing them.
Wow. Okay. So, what are some of the interesting things that you have seen as far as those goods that you found with burial sites?
So sometimes you don't find anything. Yeah, I mean, you'll find just the remains of a body.
Hmm.
And you got to wonder, well, obviously, not obviously, but typically people would be wearing clothes. Just some context. We were looking at a graveyard in the UK this year that's dated from the late second some would say mid-second, to about 6th century CE. So somewhere 150 to 500, maybe no later than 550 CE or AD. And so we know the people in general terms who were living there, but we did have some surprises. We found, quote unquote, some burials we didn't expect. And when you don't find grave goods, or you find a small amount of grave goods, you can typically associate that with a certain social status. Rich people have better stuff that goes in the ground with them that survives the archaeological record. Poor people tend to be, even if they are buried with grave goods taken with them into the afterlife, or used for like a dedication to them. Those sometimes don't survive the archaeological record because they're organic material and they decompose. So you can learn a lot about diet, how these people eat. We do a lot of osteological examinations. I'm not an expert in it. I mean, I can look at long bones and go, I know a few things. I'm not, but again, there's specialists that'll go in and go, okay, this person was approximately this age. This was their diet in general terms. This is possibly some diseases they were encountering in their life. This is an injury that healed. Things that can really tell us about what it was like to live in antiquity, which is sometimes the hardest information. I mean, we think we're a lot different than ancient people, and in some ways we are, but in some ways we're no different. I mean, we have the same longings, yearnings, and necessities sometimes. I mean, we all need food and shelter, and we have a desire for often communal activities with friends and family. That was no different in the ancient world, and you can find that quite a bit when looking at people's graves, and it helps you learn quite a bit about them. And I know some people are they get a little squeamish when you talk about burying, extracting graves, digging up the remains of long deceased people, but that's what archaeology does. So I do it, and actually in an odd way enjoy it quite a bit.
So when you're looking at these ancient burial practices and ancient burial sites, are there differences between ancient and modern, both cremation and burial practices?
Yeah, well, in big strokes, no, but in some of the, when you get down to the nitty gritty, yeah, there's actually quite a bit. Well, most people, again, I'm talking just about in the context of the area that I'm currently working at in England, although it kind of holds in general terms throughout the Mediterranean as well during the same time period. But we don't have a lot of use of what we call coffins today. Now, there were sarcophagi and other things used by certain elite classes in the Roman world, but average people, for lack of a better term, just got tossed in the ground. Mm-hmm. What we, sometimes known as common burials or pit burials, is just digging a hole, wrapping someone up, if you have the time, in a shroud or some type of material, and placing them in the ground. In Egypt, that would be, possibly a reed, a blanket. In England, it may be a linen shroud or linen wrappings, but there was some way often there was a way of preparing the body prior to death, placing them in the ground, and then covering them up. And we don't do that too much today. Many people most people today have a coffin. So when we find a coffin or a sarcophagi in an excavation, we immediately start going, wow, this person might have had some money. Because typically sarcophagi, and I'm just going to use the word coffins kind of loosely, that are buried in the ground, they're made of materials that have lasted to today for us to detect. So sometimes they're made of lead, they're often made of stone, and occasionally other materials as well that last the test time. I mean, there are wooden sarcophagi in Egypt that have lasted really well from the Roman era. Again, I'm talking about late Greek and early Roman era for most of my research. So this is a really important facet of who and what's being buried. And it looks like poor people pretty much just had a very simple burial, and it allows us to identify them in the record quite readily. Poor people don't have stuff typically buried with them, or very little stuff buried with them.
So we were talking behind the scenes about both burial and cremation. And so when I think of cremation, my dad had passed away, and he was cremated. I mean, what I see, the only thing left is dust, basically, in a nice urn. So first of all, let's talk about what the differences are between burials and cremation, and when we're talking about ancient burials, and then I want to kind of ask a few more questions from there.
Right. So burials are, the academic term is called inhumations. Inhumation, putting human in the ground is what I tell my students how they can remember it. But burial of that type, inhumation is placing a body in the ground. Now, what's interesting is even cremations in the ancient world were also burials. Typically, people were cremated. And unlike today, like you talked about, that fine powder, small jars, what you're left with, in the ancient world, there were typically a lot of long bones and other things left that were gathered, collected, and then could be placed in an urn or a larger container. Sometimes when we say urn, that's a loose term as well. It could be a box, a reliquary, something like that, placed inside. And in that box, that container is placed that in the ground itself and buried. So cremation and burial could be, in effect, a two-step process. It was uncommon. I'm not going to say it's absolutely didn't happen, but it was extremely uncommon and very atypical for you to have someone in your house. Like a cremated person needed to be in the areas that were designated for the deposition of the dead. So they needed to be in the graveyard. It would be like an act of impiety, modern heresy, for you to keep grandpa on the shelf, which many people do today. You would not have done that in the ancient Romano-British world, which is what the fancy term we like to use when we're talking about the ancient people of Britain, because they weren't just Roman, they were mostly British or native peoples that were, interacting with the Romans. And so what we see is a very progressive change in burial practices over time, but ultimately those transitions are detected in shifts that we have to determine why are they changing burial practice. Like when Christianity comes on the scene, it takes a while before older Roman practices die out, or what we call pagan practices and Romano-British practices die out before they're replaced with a normative Christian type of burial. There's a lot of different types of graves that we see and examine. Some are known as cyst or kist graves. And that's basically, I think I have a picture, but you basically take a bunch of stones and you make an artificial coffin. So you use flat stones, you make a box, and you put stones on top of it. Now, is that a coffin? Sure, it's typically referred to as a stone coffin, but it's also something that's very cheap to make. Anyone can do it. It just takes time to gather the right stones, put a little muscle into it, and you can have that type of grain. Unlike like a manufactured sarcophagus, which requires craftsmen and special expertise in order to make it. And sometimes those can be pretty rough, but still, there was an expense associated with it.
Okay, we're it kind of makes me feel like then that it was also the wealthier who tended to be cremated as well. Is that correct or not?
Well, no, because you could be cremated pretty cheaply. Unlike today, where it's a fairly elaborate practice, anyone can build a pyre and burn someone in antiquity. Again, you take someone, it was typical again, I'm really general. It was typical that when someone died before the Christian era, that they would be taken and kind of placed in state. Family and friends would come by for a few days to kind of do their commiserating, and we'd call it grieving process. But it was very formal, and in ancient Greece, it was very structured. There was actually in Rome as well, it was a set period of time. But in the Romano-British area where I'm looking at now, we don't know if it's always a set cycle. The Celts retained some of the earlier practices, even though they were living among the the Romano-British and the Romans that had moved in. And when I say Romans, I mean just anybody who wasn't British that the Romans invited over. And so we see these typical, there's still a practice of, hey, let's hang out with the dead for a few days to grieve, mourn, and do those cultural, familial, and sometimes very clannish things that we associate with the ancient Celts to say goodbye. And then the cremation part typically was also kind of a group activity. You would place some objects with the person to be cremated. You would burn those or emulate those and have those also be gathered up, placed in an urn or other container, and then that would be deposited. And then there'd be a second, sometimes a deposition of what we typically call grave goods could be added. So stuff that you didn't want cremated with them, you would have set aside typically jars and other votive objects. Sometimes, like in Egypt, it's funerary urns, typically known as canoptic jars and things like that, would be placed. Although the Egyptians didn't do cremation, but areas around that grave goods could be placed with people.
Uh-oh. I don't know if it's just you that froze up or if it's me. All right, so I'm going to go to another question. Well, I need to wait and see. Is it me or is it? It's okay. It's Pat. I was looking at the questions or the comments in the live chat. Sorry, you guys. We will just wait and see if he can come back to us. And we've had some really great questions from the audience, so or from the viewers. So I'm really hoping he can come back, and so I can kind of ask him some of these other great questions. Whenever he does come back on, I thought one of the great ones is from Farron Salas, and it's asking if he's found any pets buried with their owners in any of the burial excavations. So that will be the first one that I will include whenever he comes back, because I think that's a great question. Some of the other questions that I would really like to know from him is kind of the progression. He was talking about, how it went from the pagan traditions and how it's progressed over time. And I'm curious to have a little bit more information on what that looks like. And, I know that I've heard anyway of previous generations who have kind of sat with the dead for days. And I'm wondering if anyone had ever, if they did that, not just the couple days he was just talking about where they kind of grieve, but did they have any special rituals that they did specifically with the dead over time? And if so, how long was that? If you have any other questions that you want to ask him while we're waiting for him to come back on, please ask. We will get them on just as quickly as possible. And I'm seeing some great ones. So while we wait for him, let me just go over here to the live chat and thank some of you guys for coming on. We really appreciate that you guys have joined us. We couldn't do this without you guys. So we have Kat the Humanist is here. Of course, our producer, Wes, Farron Salas. We have So Culty. I love that name. We have Aunt Kathy. Hey, Aunt Kathy. I have missed you. I think Aunt Kathy is redoing her show, bringing her show back on. If you are doing that, put it in the chat. I think I saw something with you doing your show again. That's pretty cool. We also have Ryan Cultastic. Shane is on here. Let's see. Who else do we have? KCA Randy, good to see you. I don't often get to say hello to you guys. Let's see who else is on here. Beach Price is on. Let's see. We have going down, trying to get through. Oh, and by the way, Beach, you're awesome. Let's see. Captain Dadpool. Hey, Captain Dadpool. Good to see you. Hive Science is on. So thank you guys for coming on. I know I'm probably missing some, but I really appreciate you guys being on here. I am not an archaeologist, so I'm really hoping he can come back on because I can't talk to you about archaeology. What I can say is that, so I'll just tell you a little story about when I was growing up. We lived in New Mexico, and one thing that we used to do is go to the Indian ruins, is what they were called, Native American ruins. And they would have displays before you would walk out, go on a big long trail to get to where the ruins were. And they had all kinds of different artifacts that they had found when the archaeologists were out. And a lot of the archaeologists from the University of New Mexico would come out and do different archaeological digs. And so you could look at all these wonderful artifacts and then actually walk out and go to the old Native American ruins. So there were cooking places, like you could see where they used to cook their foods, or they would have different um, uh, areas for rituals and for religious observances and things like that. You could see how they would do those things. They had what was called adobe huts, and then they also, and a lot of those you only had almost the outline at the bottom. But then they also had you. We could climb up on a ladder and get up to. So we have Pat back. Woohoo! Hey, Pat.
Hey,
I was talking to everyone about going to New Mexico and we called it Indian ruins, but it's Native American ruins. So anyway, I was talking about that. So I'm so glad you could make it back.
thank you. That was a little bit of chaos. We're having, I wouldn't call it a heat wave, but some people are obviously calling it a heat wave because um, my daughter turned the air conditioner and the hair dryer at the same time, and we popped a breaker. So I had to
Uh,
reset. I had to reset the breakers. So.
Yes, I love that. I love it when that happens. I've had that happen before. So while you were gone, I was just kind of chatting, but there was a question that popped up in the chat that I thought I would ask you because I thought it was a really great question. And it's from Farron Salas, and it's: have you found any pets buried with their owners in any of the burial excavations that you've participated in?
So I'm going to say yes and no. We can't assume we found animals buried with people, but there are some issues with that. Where again, many of the places I've dug where we found people buried are, I'm just going to call them Roman era contexts. They're not always Roman people, but they're people that lived during the time of the Roman Empire. It was a common practice to bury dogs in graveyards as spiritual protectors. So dogs, sometimes before their time, and sometimes because they had just lived to the end of their period of life, were placed in Roman graveyards and graveyards that weren't just Roman, Celtic, Gallo-Roman, a lot of these areas that we refer to as hybridized cultures with Roman people. But we have found some like say a small dog buried right next to a person. So is that there as a spiritual protector that the family included, or was it just a beloved pet, or is it both?
Mm.
So it's hard to make direct inferences because one person's going to know that dog is dog, so.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay. And I'm going to go with a couple more because we actually have quite a few questions from the audience. I think everyone is very interested in this. So we have one from Hive Sciences or Hive Science says, "How old does the
Grave.
Greece have to be before it's ancient?" Okay.
So to be fair, that varies from place to place, country to country. It could be a grave could be 100 years old and be considered being worth excavating. In the UK, where I'm getting used to their rules and guidelines, basically a general rule of thumb is a couple hundred years. So anything Roman, we're definitely in a good place. It starts to get a little bit more dicey, you would say, is if there's an old Roman graveyard and then a medieval graveyard above it, and then a early industrialized period graveyard on top of that, then we may have problems exhuming some of the bodies, particularly if they're still living relatives. The general rule of thumb is if someone knows you're buried there and they're a family that can point a finger, we probably don't excavate. I mean, that's a general rule of thumb.
Okay, that makes sense. Um, Producer Wes asks, "Have you found any weapons or anything like that buried with them?"
Yeah, we've found weapon caches. Particularly in Romania, we're digging at a Roman fort. So we find weapons all over the place, but weapons buried with people, that's pretty rare in the Roman context. Celts were a little more prone to that, but a lot of their depositions of weapons actually occurred in sacred places around where people were buried, sacred sites. But I do also look at Neolithic sites too, say roughly in Britain, that's about 3000 BCE, and we find what we consider weapon-like objects.
Uh-oh, he is frozen again. I wonder if another breaker is gone. Can you guys all still see me? I want to make sure that it's not on mine again. I mean, not on mine. I'm just looking to see if you guys can, someone can put it in the chat. Do you still see me? I don't know if you do or not. I don't know if it's okay. There we go. There we go. There you are.
This is good. I'm looking. I'm going. No, I still have data. I mean, still have Wi-Fi, so it's not me. Yeah, I think there's heat in the Pacific Northwest, so it might still be me. So the question was, how long before someone's considered a set of human remains? Again, that's a really difficult question, and I'm kind of being glib, but I want you to know, we as an archaeologist, we have to take this really seriously, because there's a lot of considerations. Like, I work here, I'm in Washington State. I work all over the state of Washington doing CRM, cultural resource management. And so you have to understand that, like, there are people who look at the removal of bodies from a context very differently than other people. Like, there are a lot of, you need to have some empathy for people and various religious beliefs that may be outside your own. I don't have any religious beliefs, and in some places, that can be a point of contention as well.
Right. Yeah, I can totally get that. Here's another great question. We just have so many, and I want to try to get to them all. Ryan Cultastic asked, have you ever found any bones that were inscribed?
Not human bones, but we found animal bones. It was fairly common for Romans to make flutes and instrument out of long bones of various animals, and sometimes they would carve them. Sometimes they'd actually write their initials on them too. And wow. Also the creation of dice in Greek astrologoi, basically knuckle bones. Romans did that all the time, so did Greeks. So they'd carve up pig knuckles, and sometimes they'd use them for playing instruments, and sometimes they could be used in divination, so magic.
Wow. Now, it makes sense. I mean, when you say that as pig knuckles and divination, that totally makes sense.
It does.
But I will definitely look at dice in a whole new way now.
Well, and it's actually a very cool system of divination. You could do divination where you're interpreting characters that are on them, or you can have a predetermined chart. And in some oracles in the ancient world, that's how they did it. They go, if you have a 1 and a 3, it equals this. You have a 4 and a 6 equals that. Basically, you can change it from the Greek into English pretty easy, and then kind of figure out what was going on. We have some of those, I call them, divination tables that have survived. Some of them are incomplete, but it's kind of fascinating stuff.
Oh, that's cool. There's still some pagans today that use runes and,
right.
With those symbols on them. I just didn't realize that they would be made out of pig knuckles, but that it does make sense.
Well, it can be any bone, but the Romans just kind of, and the Greeks kind of, that was kind of what they used. You can use any long bone. And divination is fascinating. We go off on a whole different tangent with ancient divination. Maybe that'll be a different time.
Yeah, that sounds good to me.
So that's an area so one of the things I look at in what rituals are people doing at certain times, and grave sites are often used for divination, like the areas around graveyards, and sacred sites are often used for divination. So how do ancient people interact with sacred sites or places they deem as sacred for the purpose of gaining divine revelation?
Okay, that makes sense. So more questions. This one comes from Hive Science again. Were there any battle burials? And if so, from what battles, wars, or plagues?
So I've never excavated a war burial site or a mass grave site. So where people were just kind of thrown in mass, although they do exist. And they're kind of very prolific throughout the ancient world. Probably one of the most famous burial sites that has been somewhat excavated is where the Battle of Marathon occurred in ancient Greece. Because despite what the Greeks wrote about it later, it looks like they took all the dead Persians, and rather than giving the dead Persian soldiers a proper burial, as was somewhat custom at the time, they just threw them in mass, like really, quote unquote, disrespected them. And later, Romans said that's why the Battle of Marathon was haunted, is because the Greeks had not held up their pious activities, forcing the Persians to haunt them in death, or anybody that would go to the battlefield.
Oh, wow. Okay. Another question. If jewelry is found, is it geographical in style? Like each area has a particular style cross?
So no, in the period that I'm talking about. So okay. in Britain, I can make Romania, yes. If you compare Romania to Britain, you'll see some stylistic differences, but a lot of those differences are material form. So you'll just like they may make a, lack of a better term, simple wooden cross. Let's just talk about Christian stuff because there are Christians. We dug some of those up too. The cross can be from a different wood, or it can be a small wooden disc with a cross carved on it. Wasn't uncommon. The use of Roman coinage, particularly when it's the Roman emperor starts, simple coins that are bronze coins, could be cast in simple jewelry, punch a hole through it, wear it. We do know that, by the way, so one of the things we do find, we found several of this last season in the UK were Roman era coins that were found after the Romans had obviously left. Whether or not they were still in circulation a little bit or had been found in burials of coin hoards, it looks like the Saxon people, the post-Roman people, we call it post-Roman period, so Saxons before they're Anglo-Saxons, appear to have been wearing Roman coins as medallions, like, and I mean medallions like good luck charms, like spiritual effigies, like they were, used as tokens to ward off, not just simple displays of wealth. They had some religious function in a pagan context.
Wow. I think that's carried over to today. I think there's a lot of people who could look at that in a religious context even today.
Ryan's gone off the rails, but we won't answer that question.
So I wanted to show really quickly some of the pictures that you shared and have you kind of talk a little bit about them. So I'll just start flashing some of them up and let you talk a little bit about it. And then I promise our viewers that we will get back to your questions. All right. So here's the first one.
Yeah. So that's a pretty common grave type. That's a cyst or kiss grave. That's how we find them. So people think they're big. They're actually just wide enough to get a body in. And they're just long enough to get a body in if you bend the knees. So we typically don't find burials that are quote unquote full length. They're not someone laid out nice and flat. They're typically on their back though. And they could be possibly on their side in a like a semi-fetal position, sometimes pugilistic where their arms are up, sometimes across their chest. But typically that's how we find the graves are compact, small, and there's not a lot of extra room. And that's pretty common. And that was a grave that was actually excavated this season. And that's one of the problems too, is as these graves start collapsing in on themselves, the minute you start pulling the dirt out, the stones are already predisposed because there was a cavity there that often, because of seepage and other things, it fills with water as it ages in time, which causes those stones, which are usually set up pretty perpendicular, to start falling inwards. And the minute you start excavating it, they have a tendency to fall in quickly inward. So we do some bracing to try to keep them in place. That grave in particular, if you go back one, I just want to show you something kind of funny. So if you look towards the very back where we believe the head was, you'll notice there's a flat stone right on the ground. That's because there were stones laid on the ground, but we think there's actually another grave directly underneath this one. So there was a little bit earlier. This is probably again, I'm doing this top of my head. I don't have my notes. This one's probably about 3rd century, 4th century. So there's probably a 2nd century grave underneath it. And right behind it, you see a little hole. Some of our best finders for bones are rabbits. We will find rabbit holes, and then there'll be like little bits of bone on the outside because they're just digging, trying to get through stuff because they find bodies too. And they'll displace some of the smaller bones. And then you'll go, hey, look, there's a rabbit hole there. Hey, look, there's some teeth. And you go, they found something good. And so that we do take time to look down rabbit holes and to see what's at the other end, if you can see in. Getting a flashlight.
With at least the way I've always thought of archaeology as a layperson, obviously, is that everything that you find, it's like it's meticulously cataloged and measured and all of this stuff. Whenever you start excavating below something like that,
right?
Is there something you have to do to make sure that
right? So what we do is
preserve this,
right? And that's one thing I think a lot of people, and it's a really great question, Sonny. Archaeology is a systematic but often destructive process. Like once we excavate this grave, there's no putting it back, particularly if we go below it. Like if we know there's a body below it and we're going to excavate into it, we photograph, document, sketch, do super measurements. Sometimes we'll actually remove stone by stone into, in order to be placed back later, like do a reconstruction as exact as we can. But ultimately, we can't guarantee we can do that, and it's never going to be the same again. So it is something that sometimes you're destroying what you are looking at as part of the investigation. Now, there's also times that like we know there's stuff below something and we purposely don't penetrate, because sometimes that's known as over penetration. You dig too deep. That happens. But you sometimes will go, hey, until we've totally exhausted this one layer at one time, we don't want to dig down and have all these pits everywhere. We just won't go any further. And sometimes people will go, no, but there's stuff there. You need to dig it up. And we're like, no, we have to do that little corner over there where we know there's absolutely nothing, so we can keep it nice, even keel, do a methodological exposure of the area in an archaeological context, and then maybe not dig down any further. Maybe just use some non-invasive techniques like ground penetrating radar, right? And then go, okay, there's graves here, but we're not going to open them because we've removed the layer above them. And we may dig one of them up and do a sampling and leave most of the rest intact, because it is a very laborious process. So give an example. You saw that one grave there. There was one set of human remains in it. That took two people, pretty skilled archaeologists. Well, one student who's had a couple of years, and then like one probably graduate level student working together, one teaching the other a little bit as they go. But that takes about a week to pull up a body. So in a 3-week season, you may only excavate 2 or 3 bodies. But when you have 30 people doing it and you have 40 or 50 bodies, it makes sense, because it's not just the bodies, it's a lot of other stuff going on as well. There's a small house that we were excavating as well. So but there were enough bodies to keep it going. And when we left this season, there were bodies we started covering up, like we'd start seeing like the top of a skull. We said it would, but it was in the last week. So we said, stop. You put on the brakes, you go, cover it up. We'll come back next year. So we're going right back next year to the same graveyard and exposing a slightly different adjacent area, because we just didn't have the time or enough labor, like just not enough people to actually do it the way we needed to do it in order to properly preserve them. And that's typically the worst part of archaeology, is you run out of time, and weather can be a real pain in the ass too. We had like one day where it just poured. So that's a day you don't get to dig. You get to clean stuff and sit underneath tents as it's pouring and clean up objects, but you're not actually digging. And I don't mind digging in the mud, so I normally do it. You can't dig when it's raining, because what happens is it's muddy and it destroys you being able to figure out what layer stuff is. So it's really methodologically the worst case scenario to do it that way.
So I have a question, because I've heard this before about these seasons. So this is probably a stupid question, but I'm really curious. I know why you can't stay longer. You're heading out there for a finite amount of time.
My wife won't let me, because I would stay.
Yeah. But I'm curious why there's not like someone working there all the time.
So that's kind of interesting, because Chester House, where we're digging now, there is a full-time volunteer staff. Now, I say full-time volunteer staff, that sounds kind of odd, right? There are people digging every day of the year that weather permits, minus 4 months. They shut down the excavation during the worst part of the winter, because in England it rains. So there are people, typically retirees, and some students, high school students, will come out on the weekends, and even people that are just not on their normal jobs, and they'll come out and dig on the weekends. But there's always a trained certified archaeologist on site. Typically the site archaeologist that's their job, is to go out and make sure these very well-meaning volunteers, some with a lot of experience and some with not so much experience, can still keep digging throughout the year. So if you went over to Irchester, where we were digging this last summer, there's probably going to be a dozen people there digging in a very limited fashion in a certain area, to try to keep the work going until about October. And through October, about October, they'll start shutting down, and they might not open up again until February, March, depending on how the weather goes.
Okay. All right. So that makes sense. I was just curious about that. You know,
But in some
because
places they shut down and they're only open during the summer because a lot of these excavations rely on students. So you stick
okay.
100 students on site, you can get a lot done.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right. Your next picture.
Another cis grave, but this one's smaller. This one is actually of a small child, probably between the age of 2 and 4. And I took this picture to kind of show that some people tend to think that ancient peoples didn't like love their children as much as we do today. Well, that's not true, but they were more prone to understand the reality of life in the ancient world. Children not surviving to adulthood was a reality. Um, and So when we find children in situ in their graves, they're there. We often find them with objects, not often, I shouldn't say often. We occasionally find them with objects that kind of show that parents really cared. Maybe a toy, things like this one didn't have anything like that with it, but in other graves I've dug up as examples, we found like a children's rolling toy, like basically a ball. These kind of things where you go, parents were placing their child in the ground in a pagan context. These weren't Christians in many of these instances, but they really cared about their children and wanted their children to, quote unquote, go with something that meant something more than just simply they're gone. They were giving them objects that were associated with them in life and having them take them with them in death.
Well, that's kind of sad. I mean, it's sweet too.
But
Yeah.
you'll sometimes hear modern people talk about like, yeah, ancient people didn't care about their kids. No, they did. They did in many ways as much, and maybe a little bit more. They were super paranoid about their kids dying. I mean, Romans would not name their kids right away because it was a cultural taboo. Because if you name them, then evil mojo might happen to them. Every child in ancient Rome and other cultures adjacent, less was really common throughout the Mediterranean and in other places in the ancient Near East. Children were, as soon as they were able to like start crawling and being a toddler, they were giving a protective amulet against disease and black magic, like from right off. Like you'll see a lot of depictions of Roman children, particularly, and girls would have a different one, but boys will be wearing a little penis, a little phallus. That wasn't because they were horny little kids. That was literally because the penis was seen as a symbol of warding off evil. And girls would have a lunella, a small moon, half crescent moon. They were that as well. And you'll see Roman children depicted in art of all different types, frescoes and other things, and even in sculpture, wearing these amulets. And people go, "Oh, that's nice. They have a nice piece of jewelry. That piece of jewelry is, it's nice, but it has a totally important function that goes beyond how valuable it is. Because even poor people gave these to their children. They may carve them out of wood, but they still made them for their children."
Right. That makes sense. All right. Here's another
cis grave, but this one I like this picture because it actually shows the bottom lining really well. The fact that there was care taken to make these. It's fortunate that near Irchester there's a lot of good stone to make these type of graves out of. So we think, again, I'm not the smartest. Dr. Jeremy Taylor is kind of one of the leaders of our excavation from University of Leicester. He talks about like we do see it reflected. So in places where it's not common to have good stone for making these type of graves, we find them in lower volume, right? Poor people have to have immediately accessible materials, where rich people still seem to import their grave goods. So you can kind of talk about how prolific is the use of stone. Are they short stone where it's hard to come by, so they only save it for building houses and it's not used as much in graves? Or is it so common that they can pretty much do everything with stone they want? And we find a lot of graves lined like this. And in Irchester, we had a lot of stone. So we find a lot of cis graves alongside the more simple burial graves, pit graves.
So I'm going to now I'm going to scroll down to get to some videos.
Okay.
So I really liked this one. So I'm going to show this one. It's almost 2 minutes. So if you want me to stop it, I can see you and other people can't below the scene. So just put your finger up if you want me to stop.
Sure. Yay. So that I always get it wrong. So I actually pulled up my notes. That is Dún Cranach in Scotland. It is a multi-chambered cairn tomb, rock tomb. Now, the reason you see me walk around now, so that video, I usually shoot it after I do my measurements. So I've already walked it one time, and I have a basically kind of middle grade rangefinder. So I can, even though it's all people already have done all the measurements before, I just want to verify it for my own research purposes. Say I verified that what's currently in paperwork is still right. But that is a Neolithic chambered tomb or cairn. And what that is about 3000 BCE, that tomb was just, the chambers were created, stones were placed, and then earth and other stones were placed on top of it to make that mound structure. Now, what makes that site particularly fascinating is you saw that one on the top, that small, I walked on trying to be super careful, looking inside it. That is a chambered burial area, but it's a top. It's, then you walked around the side and you saw that where that green wood was. And it says this entrance currently closed. If I would have called the right people, sometimes as an archaeologist, you can get access to that. And I crawl into them all the time. It was raining that day and I was already late, so I didn't have time to actually figure out who I needed to call to see if someone from Historic Scotland could come out and open it for me for purposes. And someone had a couple of years before had already done an absolutely fantastic job with the site report. And so what I was more worried about when I was out there was looking at the site so I personally can understand how its geography lays out. And it's part of a complex. So that burial mound is there, for lack of a better term, that cairn. And then you saw those standing stones. Well, out near those standing stones, if the video continues on, because I shot a lot of video of this area, there's another a smaller cairn out there. Another it's lower, about 4.5 feet tall out there. So you have standing stones, one burial mound, another burial mound that had multiple people deposited into it. You can crawl into them, and there's a multi-chambered area where if you crawl under the burial mound, there's a place where there's little niches inside to hold additional bodies. Now, it's all been excavated already, but my research is about how was it reused. Not too far, it appears that during the Celtic period, that were, later than the Neolithic period, it looks like the Celts started coming and reusing some of these areas, but not for the intent, their original purpose. They were using them near there. They were conducting ritual activities. What my premise of my research is, and based on some other work that other people have done, is when people came in hundreds of years later, they saw these structures and they didn't know how they got there. So they attribute them to supernatural causations. So the site was immediately, as a phenomenological curiosity to them, but it was considered and granted as sacred nature. So then they started conducting their own ritual activities at the site. And there's a couple places like we find even during the Roman period, some of these Neolithic cairns are being used for depositions. Romans are going there, or Romano-British people are going there and depositing objects. Now, they're not burying people there. It's a burial mound, but they don't necessarily know that's the purpose. But what they know is ancient people were buried here, probably. There was some type of activity here. You have standing stones immediately adjacent. The Romans and Romano-British people knew that something really special and sacred had happened there, so they start reusing the site. And they dedicate to the spirits they believe live in the area by offering them votives. They bury objects around the tomb, like on the walls, the outskirts. They dig down a little bit and stick objects in there to offer it to the spirits that they know inhabit this place. So it's a way of engaging in ancestral worship and religious practices. It's actually removed from them. It's not like they're worshiping their own ancestors, their immediate parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, but they know that there's ancient people and ancient spirits of this place. So they're immediately granting it some sacred connotation, and they worship there for the next couple hundred years. Then Christianity comes, and then Christians take those spaces and they do the same thing. They just reinvent them as well. I one of the areas I also look at, we might have some videos, I look at wells and springs. How do wells and springs change? Neolithic period, not too far from a spring, there's a burial mound and stone circles, megalithic structures. And then we see some disuse during the Celtic period. The Romans come back and they the Celts have put maybe a small shrine there. The Neolithic people didn't have anything there. The Romans and the Celts start using it as a pagan, quote unquote, site for the worship of some type of water goddess. Typically, water goddesses are female, by the way, springs and such. And that gets into a whole different debate about sacred feminine. And then we see in the Christian period, they're reinvented and they're given a saint's name. But what the activity going on there doesn't change. It's still sacred. It's still magical healing, and is used for a variety of worship in the area as well.
That's so cool. Okay, so one thing that I thought was so cool about that video is that there were modern houses really close to that. So now I'm just thinking, I wish I lived in that house. I really wish I lived in that house. How cool is that? Is this land owned by the government? Is it owned by people and they're giving permission? I mean, how is this? How does that work?
All of it. So the United Kingdom, it's different, kind of different governments all over the place. Like Wales is slightly different than Cornwall, which is slightly different than Britain, which is slightly different than Scotland. But generally, they're either owned by the state and maintained by the state as a site, or the state will basically lease the land from the owner, with the understanding UK law is if you have something like this on your property, you have to give people access to it. So if you have cattle, you have to allow people to go into your gate, go look at this stuff and come back out, with the understanding they have to shut the gate when they leave. In the UK, people are very mindful of this. You'll come up, it'll say, this is the way to the sacred stone circle. Walk 1 mile this way. There's a little sign that says, please close the gate so the sheep don't get out. And you'll walk through a sheep field, stepping through sheep shit. I've done that a lot, like where you're kind of, having to negotiate the turds. But then you get out there and there's a small fence where the government has come in and said, okay, we're going to protect the mound itself from the sheep, but it's a mile cross country to get there. Then you go there and you stand there in awe for 20 minutes. Cause there's been a couple sites I've went to, but I've stayed at it for 3 or 4 hours because I'm measuring it. I'm doing an actual conduit where I'm walking what I believe the ancient pathways, a couple of different pathways ancient people could have walked, because I want to be able to, I take my camera, I take a lot of photos, or I've never seen another person. Like last year, I went to the Isle of Arran in Scotland, so off the coast on the interior sea between Scotland and it's actually closer to Scotland, but it's technically the Irish Sea. And they it's called Mockery Moor. It's a complex of, I'm gonna do this off the top, 7 stone circles, like 7 different stone circles, a bunch of single pillars, a bunch of tombs and cairns. That's 3 miles. So the circuit to go back and forth is 6 miles, but it was all part of this sacred landscape. And I'll actually, I think I have a video I can throw up from my YouTube real quick since people are here. Yeah. Yeah, and for those that want cheap thrills, I'm really bad at video production. I'm absolutely awful at it. But I do have a channel that I could give you if you want to look at some of this stuff. I'm not doing as much as I used to because I just don't have times. But here, if I want to get shareable link, I can throw this in there. And this is where Wes is going to have to earn his money.
Yes. Yep. There you go.
If Wes can get that in there and throw that up, that would be to give you an idea like how extensive some of these complexes can be, because it's not just the one stone circle. Like it's the stone circles in relation to the other stone circles. And the fact that some were made at 3000 BC, some were made at 2500 BCE, and then at 2200, a bunch of the stones were rearranged. So there's all these different periods of reuse, reintegration, changing, modification. And then when you look at the people are being buried, typically these people being buried, we almost always think are like, if for lack of a better term, clan heads, tribal chieftains, and their families, because we find women in these tombs as well, or cairns, and cremations. And the other thing too is there's different methods of burial in antiquity. We're kind of getting into it, but sometimes there's excarnations where either a body's exposed so the animals get to it and take the meat off and the bones are gathered and then they're buried, or the meat is flayed off. The bodies are ritually prepared. That happens too, usually after desiccation. You let them age a little bit and the meat comes off easier. Because ancient people believed that sometimes they would expose the bodies for a long period of time. Like in ancient Greece, there were caves from the Neolithic period, really the early Bronze Age, where people were just stuck kind of on a shelf and allowed to age for years. So you can imagine, not too good. Grandma's on the shelf for a while, and then grandma would be taken off the shelf and buried. But a little bit of grandma, a hand, a finger, a long bone, would be kept with the family, typically used for what is believed domestic ritual practices, magic.
Wow. How would they preserve it? I mean, would they like?
They just leave it there and let it rot.
Wow. 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 That's just crazy.
Well, and so I don't know if we have a picture, but when we were excavating, one of the things we had to excavate in the UK this year was a detached cranium. I was digging along a wall and I came up this wall, and there's a skull set inside the middle of a wall. So the wall was built up, but at a certain point during the Saxon period, so probably 6th century, between 500 and 600, there was a skull, probably an older skull, was found in the graveyard by some new Saxons settling the area, or post-Romano British people wanted to ward off the evil of the graveyard. So they stuck a skull in their house, not just one, but several. So when we're digging this wall, trying to expose the the delineation of the structure, you lift up a stone and you're like, hey, there's a skull underneath there. So what do? It's like, well, we're going to leave some of them in place and bury them again, and we're going to take a couple of them out for examination because they had obviously done it, and we know why they did it. If you want to share that, you can play it. I'll play it. Yeah, go ahead and play it. No. Oops.
Is there sound?
Pat Lowinger from beautiful historic Scotland. I am standing on the Moss Farm Cairn. This actually is part of a complex, so what I'm hoping to do is tie this all together into a much longer video, but I want to give you a 360 of the surrounding stones, plus I'm standing on the cairn itself, which an individual was found entombed in inhumation burial. They were actually physically buried, flesh and all, which shows that even though this was 3000, 2000 BCE, burial practices changed and were modified. So I hope you get you more in just a minute. Bye. And then I just kind of show you bits of it as we go along. Pat Lowinger here from the Stone Circle Complex on Arn. We will give you a little bit more information here as we do. I'm going to back up, show you this. Appears to be two concentric stone circles, one interior, one exterior. Larger stones interior, smaller stones exterior. Showing you where the original ditch was. Yeah, that's where I'm pointing out that someone had come in a couple days before and stole stones.
Oh.
Yeah. So, yep,
All right.
that's kind of what I do. When I'm not digging, I'm going around checking out landscapes.
That's really cool. I'm so glad you shared that with us. And I know we're over time a little bit, and I want to be respectful of your time, but how would you feel about just getting a few more of our
Sure.
guest questions in?
Questions are awesome.
All right. So this was one from Ryan called Tastic. I wonder if there were any lover burials like cuddling or something?
Yes, we find those all the time. I mean, they're not uncommon. And typically what they're called are the lovers. Now, I will tell you, sometimes we can't tell the difference between, if we don't have good bones for DNA, we don't know if it's brothers and sisters when they're adults, or just two people that know each other who happen to be opposite sex, or even the same gender. So saying they're lovers is typically implied. But sometimes we actually can tell because there's a child buried near them that appears to have DNA from both parents.
Okay. We have another one from, I'm going to butcher the first part, Gewesen Scott. What can we deduce about the religious beliefs of the pre-Christian burials?
Well, depends whether or not they're prehistoric people or not. But we can learn a lot about views of the afterlife too. One basic, easy concept is people that cremated didn't believe in a bodily afterlife. People that cremated believed it was a spiritual only existence. When we look at burial practices, we can kind of deduce from some of the objects that are placed with people what they thought the afterlife was going to entail. If they take very little with them, even among elites, it means that they didn't think they needed a bunch of stuff to go with them. But often, as in the case among Celtic people and the people I look at, there's quite a bit of stuff that goes with people. So the afterlife in many ways is represented as very being similar in many ways to the life they live, quote unquote, the non-spiritual life, that the spirit realm exists just beyond and in many ways parallels what they already know, so to speak. Like there's going to be green meadows and pastures in the afterlife. Why take certain object with you if you don't really have to need it? Like why take a knife unless you're going to be using it in the afterlife?
All right. I gotcha. Wes asked, from a recent post, do they ever drink coffee, wine, or beer out of an enemy's skull?
Yes, the Romans talked about it. They were really mad for the Celts and Germans for doing it.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, and they would display the heads of notable opponents as well. The Romans actually several times had to make peace treaties with certain tribes to get the heads of prominent people back.
Oh, wow.
Mhm.
Oh, wow. Okay. So the Romans never did that to their enemies, though, right? It was just.
Well, what the Romans did and what they wanted to have done with them were two different things. The Romans decapitated people as a form of public execution, but typically then they took the head and they throw it in the grave or in a separate grave than the body as a sign of disrespect. What they didn't want were the heads of Roman soldiers rotting around, quote unquote, Gaulish camps or Germans camps. Like, hey, you guys aren't supposed to have that, because the Romans did believe that desecrating the body caused the spirits of the departed not to rest well. They were anxious in the afterlife. They had not been given a proper burial, so they couldn't enjoy a peaceful existence in the afterlife. So the odds of them being a ghost or a haunt were very high.
Oh, wow. Okay. And finally, do you ever find any women Celtic warriors or other Nordic civilizations?
It's not a trick question, but it's a question that's really hard to answer. And I'm going to answer it this way. Maybe. So I have never dug in a Nordic site, but I've read literature on it. One of the problems is interpretation. If a woman is buried with a weapon, does that mean she's a warrior? It could mean when a Celtic woman, a woman living in Britain, is buried with a long knife or a dagger that appears to not be just ceremonial, which is a problem in interpreting itself. Does that mean she's a warrior? Maybe. But many societies believed that women could defend themselves. Like it's really only certain cultures in the Mediterranean where women weren't supposed to resist men at all. Germanic and Celtic societies, and that would include the Northern Germanics, the ancient Norwegians, ancient Scandinavians. It appears that women, particularly when the men who were Viking going and raiding were away, that they were expected to defend their home. It would be no different than like living on the prairie and defending your homestead. Like it was very much a similar concept. Were there women that were warriors as their primary profession? We don't know. The scholarship's mixed. There appears to at least been a few, because we read about them in kind of pseudo-historical mythologies. And we find grave goods that seem to support it in some cases. In some parts of the world, definitely women were warriors. The ancient Scythian women, who probably were the actual people that Amazons were based off of, appear to have, done a lot of warrior type ability but the Scythians also in their society were less gender normative than many other cultures around them. Women rode horseback, they shot bows. When the men were away, the Scythian women killed men. Like you came into their camp, they shot you full of arrows, and they were expected. They were a nomadic society, so they were on the move. And when one part was away, the other part, that was their job to act in that function. So there are some gives and takes, but did certain cultures, particularly the Germans and Celts, believe that women had a right to protect themselves, A, against violence, and B, against quote unquote being taken, like in the case of being taken as a slave or other things. So it's a mixed question. But were there? Sure. How many? We don't know. And were there as many as some people would hope? We're not going to know either.
That's a great way to answer that question. It makes perfect sense to me. You're basically what you find you're having to interpret, and you don't. Sometimes you may have context clues to be able to figure it out, but oftentimes it sounds like you don't, and so it's
one of the good context clues with the Anglo-Saxons is a good example. Pre-Christianization. And there's a question about the Welsh. The Welsh would apply because they Christian late. We do see burial goods, Saxon people, when the first Germanics come over into Britain. Again, Anglo-Saxons and Jutes, right? The women are more often buried with weapons. And I mean knives, things that we'd call weapons, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe not swords, but things that, if you get in a bar fight, you can make a mess of somebody. As Christianization happens, that becomes less, to the point where women aren't being buried with any weapon anymore. Mm-hmm. So there is a transition, and what that actually reflects, I would think it has something to do with a shift in gender normative roles and expectations. Mm-hmm. Certain people in the British Isles, the women are never going to give up their knives. Scotland, the Welsh women retain that kind of earlier Celtic normative than the Southern British people who become heavily Christianized quicker. Right. I mean, remember that Mercia and Wales, they Christian pretty late. I mean, when I mean Christian, they go full Christian, and they don't stop pagans, but pagan influence lasts a long time in those two regions.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So that is all of the questions from our viewers. And so I will go ahead and let you go, because I do appreciate you staying late.
Well, thanks for having me on.
Those questions are. And I'd like to ask you, do you have any final comments, anything that you would like to say to wrap everything up?
Sure. If you've enjoyed this and you want to take a class with me, I teach at Peninsula College. I threw a link in the chat, but I guess what I don't know if Wes still has it. You can throw it up on the screen. It's how to register for my upcoming class. I'll be teaching a class in the fall on Ancient Magic and Witchcraft at Peninsula College. It's taught both in person, so I'll be in front of a live classroom with online students. So if you can't make a lecture, you can watch it afterwards. But if you can make the lecture, it'll be online. You can ask questions in live chat. I'll read them. I might have someone help me with the class, a student. And then, it'll be, you can take a class with me and learn about witchcraft and magic in the ancient world.
Oh, that's fantastic. So I see Wes did put it back in the chat. We will also add it to the show notes under the video so people can look at that. And I just want to say how much I appreciate you doing this. Wes made me laugh earlier because he said, there Sonny goes geeking out. And that is very true. I was completely geeking out. And you can tell because I start leaning forward and, and just smile. There's a stupid grin on my face.
Last thing, if this is a bucket list thing for you, I retired from my first career at 42. I didn't go on my first excavation till I was 46. 46. I've only been doing archaeology really as, a student till I went back to school in 2014. So I'm a neophyte in many ways. What I would encourage people, if you want to go on an archaeological excavation, you go and you do it. You figure out what country you want to go to and dig up stuff, and you find out how you go there. Now, the Archaeological Institute of America, AIA, you can go to their website and type in excavations, and they'll tell you every excavation that takes students. It'll tell you if you have to be a student of university or if you just be a general volunteer. Now, I can tell you, if you go to Britain next year and sign up, you'll find an excavation. You just contact people that are running these things, say, what do I have to do to be part of this for a couple weeks? Come out for a week, dig stuff, learn some stuff, drink beer in the afternoons, because that's what we do. It's the greatest thing ever. Get up early, work hard, play hard in the afternoon, get up the next day, do it all over again. And there's places in Italy, France, Spain, all throughout the Mediterranean. There's places locally near your house. If you want to study the American colonial movement, trust me, there is a group of dedicated volunteers somewhere near you. If you want to dig, help with other landscapes throughout North America, there is someone somewhere that wants to help. There have been excavations canceled because they can't get enough volunteers. And it may not be just archaeology, but paleontologists are always looking for people to help dig them stuff up. I'm not saying archaeology is cooler, but it seems like it's easier to get volunteers for archaeology than paleontology, because paleontology sometimes seems like they work harder, but when they find something that's huge, right? So,
right.
Or you just collect shells all day, that shell fossils, that's also could be your job. So again, if you have any, it's the Archaeological Institute of America, AIA, and go do it, and you can cross it off your bucket list.
Yes, absolutely. I'm definitely going to have to do that because I just think it's absolutely fascinating. So thank you so much once again for coming. And I want to
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I want to thank all of our viewers too. If this is the type of content that you like, and I love it, or I wouldn't be here. If you guys like it like I do, be sure to like, subscribe, share, hit the bell, all those good things. Consider joining our Patreon with special perks. One of those is, if you become a Patreon, we can send you a link and you can come on the show with us and ask our guest a question. Instead of having me read it out, you can actually ask the question yourself. So I want to thank our current Patreons. We have Kathy Cotton, Cindy Plaza, Bryce Aroni, Deborah Grace, Aaron Coalson, Phil Calderone, and me. I want to thank our producers, Wes, Phil, and Kat, and the booking team, Aaron and Shane. Remember, we have other shows, Secular Soapbox, Women Atheists Unloaded, The Bible Says What, and our newest show, Global Atheist. That is on Saturdays at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So until next time, always remember to think critically. Good night, everybody.